The landscape of Bavaria in early spring is deceptive. In the tourist brochures, it is a place of rolling green hills and warm hearths, but in March of 1922, the region north of Munich was a place of biting cold and aggressive isolation. The snow had fallen heavy and wet, blanketing the flatlands in a white silence that absorbed sound and hid the features of the terrain. 60 kilometers from the city, nestled between the dark expanse of the Hexenholz forest and the small town of Schrabenhausen, lay a farmstead known locally as Hinterkaifeck. It was not a welcoming place. The farm was physically separated from the nearest village of Gruber by nearly a kilometer of open field and dense woods. It stood alone, a fortress of timber and stone against the elements. To understand what happened there, one must understand the absolute quiet of a rural homestead before the age of electricity and constant communication. When the sun went down, the darkness was total. If you were in trouble at Hinterkaifeck, no one could hear you. No one was coming to save you. The Gruber family belonged to the farm. They were wealthy by the standards of the peasantry, owning good land and robust livestock, but they were social pariahs. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, was a man known for his violent temper and controlling nature. He held a tight grip over his wife, Cecilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They were a family that kept to themselves, partially out of preference and partially out of shame. Rumors had swirled for years about the true nature of the relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. There had been court cases, imprisonments for incest, and whispers that the youngest child, Joseph, was not the son of a local laborer or a fallen soldier, but the son of his own grandfather. Whether true or not, the gossip built a wall around Hinterkaifeck higher than any fence. They were alone in that house, trapped in a dynamic of secrets and dominance. But in the weeks leading up to March 31st, 1922, the isolation shifted from social to predatory. The atmosphere on the farm changed. It began with the previous maid. 6 months prior to the incident, she had fled the house in a state of near hysteria. She told the villagers that she could no longer stay at Hinterkaifeck because the house was haunted. She spoke of footsteps in the attic when no one was there, of voices in the night, and a constant, oppressive feeling of being watched. Andreas Gruber dismissed her as foolish and unstable. He was a practical man who did not believe in ghosts. He believed in what he could see and what he could hit. But by mid-March, Andreas began to encounter things he could not hit. It started with small inconsistencies. A set of house keys went missing. They was simply gone from the hook where they always hung. The family searched the small house farm top to bottom, but the keys had vanished. Then, days later, Andreas found a newspaper lying on the property. It was a Munich daily paper, not the local gazette they subscribed to. No one in the family had bought it. The postman had not delivered it. It was a physical object from the outside world that had been brought into their private sanctuary by hands unknown. Andreas spoke to neighbors about these oddities, but he did so with a mix of confusion and stubborn pride. He wasn't scared, not yet. He was irritated. He told a neighbor about finding scratches on the lock of the tool shed, as if someone had been trying to pick it. But the defining moment, the detail that moves this case from a rural tragedy to a nightmare, came after a fresh snowfall.
A few days before the end, Andreas went out to check the perimeter of his land. The snow was pristine, a fresh white sheet covering the world. As he walked near the edge of the forest, the Hexenholz, or witch's wood, he stopped. There were tracks. Clear, distinct boot prints broke the smooth surface of the snow. They emerged from the darkness of the tree line and marched purposefully across the open field toward the farm. Andreas followed them. His eyes traced the path of the intruder. The footprints led all the way to the machine room, a building connected to the main barn and the house. Andreas looked for the return tracks. He scanned the snow leading back to the woods, looking for the trail of the person leaving. There were none. The footprints led to the house, and they stopped. Andreas Gruber stood in the freezing cold, staring at the evidence that someone had walked out of the forest, entered his property, and apparently had never left. He searched the barn, he searched the machine shed, he found no one, yet the snow did not lie. Someone was there. That night, the family heard footsteps in the attic above their bedrooms. The heavy wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of a person pacing back and forth. Andreas took his shotgun and climbed the ladder to the attic. He swept the beam of his lantern into the dusty corners, checking behind the stacks of old furniture and grain sacks. It was empty, but the moment he returned to the floor below, the noises would eventually return. It creates a picture of psychological siege. Imagine the terror of the daughter, Victoria. She is living in a house with an abusive father, 2 young children, and the absolute certainty that a stranger is living in the crawl spaces above her head. They were sharing their home with a phantom. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. It was a tragic twist of fate. Maria was 44 years old, a hard-working woman who had been hired to replace the maid who had fled 6 months earlier. Her sister accompanied her to the farm to help her carry her trunk. Her sister stayed for a cup of coffee, chatted briefly with the Grubers, and then left around 5 p.m. She would be the last person to see the inhabitants of Hinterkaifeck alive. Maria Baumgartner had been in the house for less than 2 hours. She was likely unpacking her things in the small maid's chamber, perhaps trying to settle her nerves in this gloomy, silent house.
What happened next has been reconstructed through forensic analysis of the scene, blood spatter patterns, and the positions of the bodies. As twilight fell and the farm plunged into darkness, the killer made their move. They did not break down the front door. They did not smash a window. They were likely already inside, or they lured the family out one by one. The sequence of events suggests a noise or a disturbance in the barn. The barn was connected to the house via a covered passageway, allowing the family to tend to the animals without going out into the snow. It appears that Andreas Gruber was the first to go. He walked from the kitchen into the barn. As he stepped through the doorway, he was struck instantly. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe, with a blade on one side and a pick on the other. It was a brutal, crude instrument. The blow was massive and fatal. His body was dragged into a corner and covered with hay. Then his wife, Kazelia, followed, perhaps calling out for her husband, wondering why he hadn't returned. She stepped into the barn and met the same fate. She collapsed next to Andreas. The killer waited. There was no rush. The silence of the snow-covered fields absorbed any sound. Victoria Gabrielle came next. She was struck down and fell beside her parents. The most harrowing aspect of the crime scene is the death of 7-year-old Kazelia. She followed her mother and grandparents into the barn. She was not killed instantly. The autopsy later revealed that she survived the initial attack for several hours. She lay in the straw next to the bodies of her family, terrified and in pain. In her agony, she had torn clumps of hair from her own head. The killer then moved into the house. They walked through the connecting passage, the mattock dripping in their hand. They went to the maid's room. Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bed. She never even had time to unpack her trunk fully. Finally, the killer went to the bedroom of Victoria Gabrielle. There, sleeping in his bassinet, was 2-year-old Joseph. The killer struck the child with a heavy blow to the face, ending the family line completely. 6 people were dead. The house was now a tomb. But the horror of Hinterkaifeck is not just in the act of murder. It is in what happened afterward.
In a typical homicide, the killer flees. The adrenaline fades, the fear of capture sets in, and they run. At Hinterkaifeck, the killer stayed. For 3 days after the massacre, the farm appeared to be functioning. On Saturday, April 1st, 2 coffee sellers came to the door to take an order. They knocked and waited. They saw no one, but they noticed the gate to the machine house was open. They left, sensing something was wrong, but not knowing what. On Sunday, neighbors noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the farmhouse. Someone was keeping the fire going. Someone was keeping the house warm. The cattle in the barn were lowing for food, and they were fed. The killer, living in the house with the corpses of the family he had just slaughtered, went out to the barn, stepping over the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the child, to feed the livestock. They milked the cows. They went into the kitchen and ate the family's food. Bread and meat were consumed from the pantry. The bed in the spare room had been slept in. This detail changes the profile of the killer entirely. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a frenzied maniac who snapped and ran. This was someone who felt comfortable in that house, someone who felt they had a right to be there. Or perhaps someone so detached from humanity that living among the dead meant nothing to them. The discovery came on April 4th. The village of Gruber had begun to talk. The young girl, Cecilia, had not shown up for school on Saturday or Monday. The postman reported that the mail was piling up. Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who lived nearby, decided to investigate. Schlittenbauer is a complex figure in this story. He was a former suitor of Victoria Gabriel. He had claimed to be the father of little Joseph, then denied it, then claimed it again. He had a contentious relationship with old Andreas Gruber. Schlittenbauer gathered two other men, Jakob Schigel and Michael Pohl, and they trekked through the snow to the farm. The place was silent now. The smoke had stopped. The dog, the Spitz, was barking frantically from inside the barn. They forced open the barn door. The dog lunged at them, terrified and aggressive, and they had to tie it up. Then, in the dim light of the barn, they saw the shapes under the hay. Schlittenbauer was the first to approach. He moved the hay and a door that had been placed over the bodies. Beneath, he found the gruesome stack of corpses. Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter. The other two men were paralyzed with shock, but according to their testimony, Schlittenbauer acted strangely. He didn't recoil. He began to handle the bodies, lifting the head of Andreas Gruber, untying the cattle. He seemed to know his way around the crime scene too well. Then he ran toward the house, unlocking the front door with a key that the other men didn't know he had, or perhaps the key was in the door. The details are murky, clouded by time and suspicion. Inside the house, they found the maid and the baby. The baby, Joseph, was covered with one of his mother's skirts as almost a gesture of remorse or concealment.
The police investigation that followed was a disaster of 1920s rural forensics. The crime scene was trampled by onlookers before the Munich police could arrive. Officers slept in the beds of the victims. They cooked food in the kitchen. They contaminated every surface. The autopsies were performed in the barn on a makeshift table made of a door placed over feed troughs. In a final, macabre indignity, the heads of the victims were removed by the medical examiners and sent to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants in a desperate attempt to find the killer. The heads were never returned. They were lost during the chaos of World War II. The family was buried headless in the local cemetery. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Vagrants, traveling craftsmen, and political extremists were all considered, but the suspicion always drifted back to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He knew the layout of the farm. He had a motive, the dispute over the child and the rejection by the family. He was the one to find the bodies. He acted strangely at the scene, but there was never enough concrete evidence to charge him. He sued people for slander who called him the murderer, winning his cases, but he lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. He died in 1941, taking his secrets to the grave. Another theory suggests the killer was the husband of Victoria Gabriel, Karl Gabriel. He was supposedly killed in World War I in the trenches of France in 1914. However, his body was never positively identified. Rumors persisted that he had survived, deserted, and returned to take revenge on his wife and her incestuous father. This would explain why the killer felt comfortable staying in the house. It was his house. It would explain why the dog didn't attack the killer during the 3 days they cohabited. But these are just theories. The truth remains buried in the frozen earth of Bavaria. In 1923, 1 year after the murders, the farm was demolished. The locals wanted to erase the stain of the event from the landscape. They tore down the house, the barn, and the machine shed. While tearing it down, they found the murder weapon, the mattock, hidden in the attic floorboards, covered in dried blood. They also found a penknife in the hay that no one in the family owned. Today, nothing remains of Hinterkaifeck but a shrine. A simple crucifix stands in the middle of a flat, open field, marking the spot where the house stood. It is a lonely place. The wind sweeps across the farmland, unbroken by trees or walls. The case haunts Germany to this day because of the intimacy of the violation. It wasn't just a murder, it was an invasion. The killer watched them. He walked in their footprints. He slept in their attic. He waited for the snow to trap them, and then he systematically dismantled their lives. When you look at the photographs of the scene, the black and white images of the barn, the bodies half buried in straw, you are looking at the result of a patience that is almost inhuman. The footprints in the snow are the enduring image. It is the ultimate nightmare of home security. We lock our doors to keep the danger out. But at Hinterkaifeck, the danger had walked in days ago, and it was waiting for them to fall asleep. The tracks led to the house, and they never came out, because the monster had found its home.